The lantern is wrong. Clem Durfee notices it before he finishes tying his horse to the gate post. A tin oil lantern hanging from the iron ring where Winston Justice usually knotted his dogs at night, burning orange and steady in the middle of a clear October morning with the sun already 40 degrees above the ridgeline. Not swinging, not smoking, just burning in full daylight. In 11 years of riding this route, Clem has never seen Winston Justice waste oil that way. He calls the name from the gate. His voice carries cleanly. It is a still morning, 41 degrees. Frost still white on the north face of every fence post along the property line. No answer. He calls again. A crow lifts from the tree line behind the barn, crosses east over the ridge, and disappears. Nothing else moves. He unlatches the gate and walks up the path. In his left hand, he carries 4 envelopes for the Eustace family, 2 from a son in Akron, Ohio, 1 from a feed supplier in Abingdon, and 1 bearing a War Department stamp and a Washington postmark, dated October 9th, 1918. He has carried the government letter for 9 consecutive delivery days because the last 2 visits produced no answer, and he has not wanted to leave a War Department envelope unattended on a porch. He steps onto the boards. He knocks 3 times on the door frame. The door opens 4 inches. Not enough to see a face. A young woman's voice comes from behind it, taut, stripped of everything except the words it needs. Don't come closer. Don't leave anything. We cannot take anything in. Clem stands on the bottom step. He asks, "Does the family need a doctor? Does anyone need him to carry a message into Grundy?" A pause of 3 or 4 seconds. Then, "Half the creek is the same as us. There's no point going for anyone." The door closes. He stands on the porch and counts to 9. An old habit from years of managing frightened horses on narrow switchbacks, where a rushed movement doubles the cost of every mistake. Then he walks back to the gate. He folds all 4 envelopes together and puts them inside his canvas coat, against his chest, next to the warmth of his body. He unties his horse. He rides on. It is October 18th, 1918. He has 4 more miles to cover before the hollow opens toward Grundy. He will return to this gate on Tuesday. He will call Winston Justice's name from the same post. The lantern, he already knows, will not be burning by then, and the reason will have nothing to do with oil. Rural Route 4 out of Grundy, Virginia, ran 34.2 miles from the post office door to the farthest delivery point and back. It served 112 registered addresses, farmhouses, mill cottages, a single-room schoolhouse on Dismal Creek, 2 Baptist churches, a general store at the junction of the county road and the Hazel Creek Trace, and a scattering of dwellings so deep in the hollow draws that Clem sometimes dismounted and led his horse the last quarter mile on foot, rather than risk a broken leg on the shale outcrops above the creek bed. This was Southwest Virginia in 1918, the coal country and the ridges above it, a landscape of thin-soiled farms and company-leased patches, of families that had worked the same creek bottom for 4 and 5 generations, and who had developed a specific, earned wariness toward any institution, public or private, that arrived from outside the ridge. The mail carrier was the exception. Clem Durfee was the exception. He had earned that status over 11 years of showing up 6 days a week, regardless of weather, regardless of road conditions, regardless of the seasonal mud that made the upper section of his route genuinely dangerous between February and April when the frost came out of the ground and the creek crossings rose without warning. He earned $1,100 per year. The post office department provided the leather saddlebags, the official postal cap, and a copy of the carrier's instruction manual, 18 pages that governed everything from the handling of damaged parcels to the procedure for reporting road conditions that made delivery physically impossible. He was responsible for his own horse, his own saddle, his own rain gear, and his own judgment in the dozens of situations that 18 pages of regulation had no language for. The rural free delivery program that employed him was less than 2 decades old in 1918. Congress had made it permanent in 1902 after an experimental period launched with 82 test routes in 1896. By the autumn of 1918, it covered more than 43,000 routes across the country, traveling a combined total of approximately 1.2 million miles of American road, track, and trail. In the mountain counties of southwestern Virginia, it had changed the texture of daily life more fundamentally than either the telegraph or the railroad, because it required nothing of the family except being home. A woman on Hazel Ridge could receive a letter from her son at Camp Lee without harnessing a horse or planning a trip to town around the weather and the workload. She could get a seed catalog, a money order, a draft notice. She could stay connected to a country that was otherwise entirely on the other side of the ridge. Clem Durfee was that connection. He knew every name on every mailbox on 34.2 miles of mountain route. He knew which families were watching their third son turn 17. He knew that old Martin Ratliff on Station Creek left a jar of sourwood honey on the gatepost every September as a wordless gesture of goodwill toward the federal government, a gesture Ratliff himself could not have explained in any language he possessed. He knew the pitch of the Sizemore dogs before he cleared the upper ridge, and the degree of lean in the Combs mailbox post that told him, without looking, whether there was already a letter inside. He knew these things because paying attention was his work. It was also, as it turned out, the foundation of everything that came next. The first signs were easy to explain away. On October 9th, 4 delivery points on the upper section of his route produced no answer. Doors closed. Chimneys cold. No visible activity at mid-morning on a clear workday. He left the mail where he always left it when a family was out working the back pasture. He noted nothing. There were 12 ordinary reasons for a closed door on a Tuesday in October. On October 14th, 9 of the 17 upper section addresses showed no response. 2 of those homes had mail sitting exactly where he had placed it 3 days earlier. Untouched mail, 3 days out. That was a different kind of closed door. He picked up the earlier pieces. He held them a moment. He kept riding south toward the lower section of the route. 3 days after that, he reached the Eustis homestead and heard the voice behind the 4-inch gap. And he understood that individual sickness had become something else. Something that moved through a drainage the way a hard rain moved. From the high ground down, following the draws, visiting every structure along the way. He returned to Grundy that afternoon with 31 pieces of undeliverable mail and set them on the counter in front of Gerald Fitch, the Grundy postmaster, a deliberate and competent man of 56 who had managed this office since 1912. Fitch sorted the envelopes with practiced efficiency. He stamped each piece with the date and the regulation notation. He said, "Probably the grip working through those hollows. Give it a week. These families are tough." Clem asked whether he thought the county health office ought to know. Fitch looked up from the stamp. He was not dismissive. He was genuinely tired. "Sykes is already backed up 3 weeks with town cases. We'd be putting more on a man who can't get to what he already has." The 31 letters went into the holding drawer. That was a Friday. The next Tuesday, Clem came back with 58. Fitch looked at the stack for a long moment. He did not pick it up. He said he would need to order additional stamps for the return notices. That was the only adaptation the system made. That Tuesday evening, Clem Durfee went home and found the old saddlebag in his barn. A worn model he had replaced 2 years earlier. Sound at the bottom, but fraying at the buckle seam. He cleaned it out and set it on the kitchen table. He opened his composition notebook, a school children's model, cardboard covers, cream pages with a red margin line, and turned to the first clean page. He wrote the date at the top, October 22nd, 1918. Below it, he began a list. Each entry had 4 parts: family name, delivery address by creek and hollow designation, date of first failed delivery, and any observation from the most recent visit. He used his sharpest pencil and pressed hard enough that the indentations carried through 2 pages beneath. He worked from memory across 3 clusters: Upper Hazel Creek, Station Creek, Poverty Ridge. He wrote for 40 minutes in the quiet of his kitchen with the fire settling behind him. This was not what the carrier's instruction manual required. Nowhere in 18 pages of federal regulation was there any provision for a rural carrier to maintain a private geographic index of the living and the unreachable. What Clem was building had no official name, no authorized category, no designated storage location. It was a document that should not exist, recording a situation the government had not prepared any form to describe. Starting that Friday, when he returned from the route with 74 more undeliverable pieces, he separated them. 41 pieces, addresses where he had seen some sign of life, a curtain moved, a fresh boot print at the gate. He returned to Fitch. The other 33 he brought home in the old saddlebag. He had decided something on the road that afternoon, crossing the lower Hazel Creek ford with the water cold over his boots. He had decided that the regulation and the reality were no longer the same size, and that if the regulation could not hold what he was seeing, then he would need to find something that could. 3 times he tried to hand the information to someone with authority over it. 3 times it went nowhere. On November 7th, his day off, he walked into the Buchanan County Board of Health office in the courthouse annex and asked to speak with whoever was managing the influenza response for the rural precincts. A records clerk named Mrs. Edna Vanover received him. She listened carefully. She wrote his name and the words "Postal Route Concern" on her notepad. He never received a reply. On November 19th, he telephoned the Virginia State Board of Health in Richmond from the public telephone at the Grundy drugstore. The call cost 40 cents. A receptionist took his name, his position, and a summary of his concern, and said the appropriate department would follow up. He left the drugstore telephone number. No one called. On December 4th, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote a 3-page letter to the State Board of Health in Richmond. He described the route, the count, his cluster observations, the fresh graves at 15 addresses, The 6 abandoned homesteads, the 3 sites where no account, living or dead, could be found at all. He mailed the letter that afternoon. He kept a handwritten copy in the composition notebook. He found no record in anything that survived him that the letter was ever opened by anyone in Richmond. He put the pen down and sat with the closed notebook on the table in front of him, and understood, in a specific and settling way, that this was going to be his alone. By December, the kitchen table was no longer adequate. He had moved it all to the barn, a wooden crate in the back corner, away from the damp, under a canvas cover. The letters were sorted by cluster and stacked oldest on top within each group, each bundle held together with a rubber band from the general store at the Dismal Creek Junction. The composition notebook lived on top of the crate. By December 1st, the crate held 391 pieces. By December 31st, it held 487. He had developed the habit of noting, on the right-hand page of the notebook, what he observed when he returned to previously silent addresses. The pattern that emerged across November and December was not one any medical professional had been sent to document. At 15 addresses with previously listed failed deliveries, he found graves, fresh mounds, no markers yet in most cases. The earth still visibly disturbed within the past 30 to 60 days. At 6, the homestead had been vacated, doors left open, livestock gone. The family walked out of the hollow to wherever family could take them. At 3 addresses, he found none of the above. Just the house, the cleared ground, the mailbox post with nothing in it, and no indication readable in any ordinary evidence available to a visiting postal carrier of what had happened to the people inside. He wrote those 3 addresses on a separate page at the back of the notebook and drew a box around them in pencil. He left the box empty. He did not know what to write inside it. The Virginia State Board of Health's final report on the 1918 influenza epidemic reached the Grundy Dispatch in March 1919. Buchanan County's rural precincts received 4 sentences in the published summary and a footnote that cited incomplete survey coverage. The total influenza death toll for the county, 21,000 people across several hundred square miles of mountain terrain, was listed at 34. No field survey was cited. No source methodology was explained. No postal record was consulted. Clem sat at his kitchen table with the newspaper. He read the 4 sentences twice. He folded the paper, carried it to the barn, opened the composition notebook, and wrote 1 number at the bottom of the last page used. 500. He drew a single line beneath it and put the pencil down. He would have sealed it there. The crate under the canvas, the line beneath the number, the whole weight of it settled into silence. Except for what happened on the morning of March 22, 1919. Gerald Fitch was at his door at 7:15 a.m. before the coffee had finished. He was holding his postal cap in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim. In 11 years of professional acquaintance, Clem had never seen Fitch carry his cap like that. Fitch came inside. He sat down at the kitchen table. He said a regional postal inspector from the Roanoke district, a man named Caldwell, was conducting an administrative audit of rural Route 4. He would be reviewing undeliverable mail records for the period September 1918 through February 1919. He was arriving in 4 days. Fitch set his cap on the table. He looked at the kitchen window. He looked at the barn beyond it. He said, I need to know whether the numbers you gave me are the numbers he's going to find, Clem. Clem understood precisely what was being asked. The official Grundy ledger showed a specific count of returned undeliverable items for those 6 months. Every piece in that count had been stamped. Every piece had been logged. The count was accurate, for the letters Clem had given Fitch. In the barn, under a canvas cover, sat 500 pieces of United States mail that had never been stamped, never been logged, and never entered any federal record. They were government property. They had been in his custody without authorization for 5 months. Depending on how a man from Roanoke chose to read the regulation, and federal regulations existed specifically to be read without sympathy, this was not a clerical oversight. It was a federal offense. 31 years on the route. His pension, his house, his horse. He looked at Fitch across the table. He said, "I'll need to think about that." Fitch stood up and put his cap back on. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and said, without turning, 4 days isn't long, Clem. Think fast. The door closed. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, past the fence line and the bare hickory at the edge of the yard, the barn stood in the cold morning light with its door shut, and its canvas and its crate, and its 500 pieces of evidence that 34 was not the number, had never been the number, and that someone in Richmond had filed a report, knowing exactly how incomplete their count was. Clem sat alone at his kitchen table for a long time. He had 4 days to decide whether to burn the evidence or defend it. He did not sleep. He lay in the dark with his boots still on and the kitchen lamp burning down, and sometime before 3 in the morning he made the only decision that felt like his own. He was not going to burn the letters. He had been running the arithmetic since Fitch closed the door. 31 years on the route. A pension that would begin at 70 if he kept his record clean. A charge under the 1872 Postal Act. Unauthorized retention of undeliverable first-class mail that could remove both in a single federal proceeding. He understood the cost clearly and without sentimentality, the way he calculated creek crossing depth or trail surface in bad weather. Not with feeling, but with the specific attention of a man who knows that a wrong estimate has permanent consequences. And then he set the arithmetic aside. Because 500 letters addressed to people who could not receive them were not an accounting problem. They were a count. The only count. And a man from Roanoke named Caldwell was not going to arrive in 4 days and find a swept barn and a carrier with nothing unusual to report, while the Virginia State Board of Health's final tally of 34 collected dust in a file in Richmond and 3 families in a box in the back of his notebook stayed unnamed and unresolved forever. He rose at 3:15. He went to the barn. He moved the crate behind the feed storage wall, 2 layers of canvas over it, a broken harness frame on top, a coil of old rope beside it. Then he went back inside, poured the cold coffee, and began thinking carefully about which people in Buchanan County might be willing to hear what he knew, and which of them had enough standing to matter. He had 4 days. He intended to use every one of them. There were 2 categories of man Clem might approach, and he separated them in his mind the way he separated his mail clusters, by geography and likelihood of reception. The first category was political. The second was legal. He tried both. He was wrong about both. The county commissioner for the western precincts was named Harlan Webb. 52 years old, a former timber contractor who had held elected office since 1909 and who had the particular durability of a man who never commits to anything he cannot immediately walk back. He maintained a courthouse office on Tuesdays and Thursdays and was otherwise reachable at his property on the lower Dismal Creek Road, 17 miles from any delivery point on rural Route 4, which Clem had always considered a meaningful distance. He waited 40 minutes on the bench outside Webb's office on March 23rd. Webb arrived, recognized him, and produced the reflexive warmth of a politician who understood that postal carriers knew every name on their routes, which meant they knew considerably more than was strategically comfortable. Webb listened for 11 minutes without interrupting. Clem laid out the crate, the notebook, the cluster count, the 15 fresh graves, the 6 abandoned homesteads, the 3 addresses with no resolution of any kind. When he finished, Webb was quiet for a moment. He nodded slowly, the way men nod when they are deciding how much of their reaction to show. You're describing a county that had no functioning health response in its most isolated precincts during the worst epidemic in 50 years, he said. Clem said that was exactly what he was describing. Webb straightened the papers on his desk. He said, "And you understand that confirming this in any official capacity means opening a record that shows Buchanan County failed during a federal public health emergency. That invites inquiry into the county health board, into the state board, into every elected official whose name appears on any document from that period." Clem asked if that was a reason not to confirm it. "It's a reason," Webb said. "Not unkindly, not with visible guilt, with the flat finality of a man who has learned, in 23 years in office, to identify the exact moment when a thing becomes more expensive than the principle attached to it. What you have is a postal problem. Take it to the inspector and let the department handle it." Clem left the courthouse and rode to Chester Prater's office on the main street. Prater was 34, a Washington and Lee law degree, a practice that ran on property disputes and estate work. He had the reputation of a man who read documents carefully and said what they contained without elaboration. He read the relevant section of the 1872 Postal Act that Clem had copied by hand from the Grundy Library's copy of federal statutes. He read it twice. He set it on the desk and said, "You've been in possession of first-class federal mail without authorization for approximately 5 months. The statute does not distinguish between sympathetic retention and willful theft. The act is the act." Clem asked what his options were. Prater folded his hands. "Return the letters to the post office immediately. Tell Fitch there was a sorting irregularity across multiple route days that you've now identified. Put nothing in writing. Answer Caldwell's questions about volume in the most general terms available to you, and move the notebook somewhere that is not your barn." He paused a moment. "Whatever is in that notebook, keep it away from the letters. They cannot be found together." Clem thanked him. He left. He did not return the letters to the post office. He did move the notebook to the inside of his coat, where it rode against his ribs for the next 4 days, like a second heartbeat. Robert Caldwell arrived in Grundy on the morning of March 26th. He was 47 years old and had the unhurried, economical manner of a man who has conducted enough federal audits to know that what he is looking for is almost never where the ledger says it should be. he set up in the back room of the Grundy post office with the route ledger, the bundle of returned undeliverable items from the September to February period, a standard audit form, and a mechanical pencil that he sharpened exactly twice in the 3 hours he worked before calling Clem in. Clem sat across the table. Caldwell opened the ledger to October. He said, Route 4 shows a substantially elevated undeliverable volume for this period compared to the same 6 months in both 1916 and 1917. What's your explanation? Clem said there had been widespread illness in the rural precincts. Many families had been unable to come to their doors. Caldwell wrote something. He said, "The count you returned to this office for the full 6-month period is 312 items. For a 112-point route during a documented epidemic, that is a low figure." Clem said that some families had recovered between delivery attempts and had accepted their mail before he formally marked items undeliverable. Caldwell looked at him with the patient attention of a man who has heard many accurate statements that were not the full truth. He said, "Are you telling me that 312 items represents the complete undeliverable volume for rural Route 4 between September 1918 and February 1919? Clem held the eye contact. He said yes. Caldwell wrote for approximately 30 seconds. He closed the ledger. He said he would be filing a notation of administrative irregularity with the Roanoke District Office. Not a charge, not a termination recommendation, a flag to be reviewed at the next annual evaluation, reflecting a statistical anomaly in the route's delivery records. He stood and gathered his papers. At the door, he paused. He said, "I've done 11 years of rural route audits across 4 states, Carrier. I know what epidemic delivery volumes look like when they hit paper. What I saw in that ledger is not what epidemic volumes look like." He settled his hat. "Whatever you have, I hope you've put it somewhere it matters." He walked out without waiting for an answer. Clem carried the notation of administrative irregularity home in his coat pocket, alongside the composition notebook. He was not fired. He was not charged. He was flagged, which meant he was visible, and which meant the gap in the official count was now, in some small formal way, on record in Roanoke. Not in Richmond, not in any health file, but somewhere. He wrote his route for the following week and delivered what there was to deliver. The hollow was beginning to come back to itself. Doors opened. Smoke rose from chimneys. Women took their mail without making eye contact, which was its own form of communication. A man on Upper Hazel Creek asked Clem, with careful casualness, whether he knew what had happened to the Dingas family above Poverty Ridge, the ones up the footpath, past where the wagons could go. Clem said he wasn't certain. He said he hoped they were well. The man nodded slowly and said nothing more, and Clem wrote on, and the word Dingas joined the 3 entries in the pencil box at the back of the notebook. On April 8th in the evening, he stood in the barn with the Station Creek bundle in his hands and made a decision he had been postponing since November. He held the envelope addressed to Otis Begley at Station Creek, carried since October 16th, one of the 3 addresses in the pencil box, and he thought about what Chester Prater had told him, and what Commissioner Webb had told him, and what Caldwell had almost told him in the doorway. Then he opened the envelope. The letter was dated October 5th, 1918. 2 pages, pencil, in the careful hand of a young man who had spent a considerable effort making each letter legible and each sentence mean only what he intended. Private Earl Begley of Camp Lee was writing to his father, and he was trying to say something large inside a small, careful frame. He wrote that 14 men from their section of the hollow were sick in camp. He named them. He listed 14 family names: Begley, Justus, Deal, Sizemore, Ratliff, Combs, 2 more Combs from different branches: Mullins, Varney, Stiltner, Elswick, Blankenship, Shortridge, and a name spelled Dingus from up the Poverty Ridge side, which Earl described as the ones that live up above where the path goes. He wrote that the ward was filling faster than it could be cleared, and that the camp doctors were managing more cases than Clem would likely have found believable. His handwriting tightened in the last paragraph. He told his father to stay out of town, to keep the door closed, to keep the family on the ridge until the weather turned hard and cold. "I think the cold will stop it," the letter said. "I am counting on the cold to stop it." Clem carried the letter inside and opened the composition notebook. He cross-referenced every family name against his cluster index. 11 of the 14 surnames appeared in his undeliverable mail records, all on Station Creek or Lower Hazel Creek, with first failed delivery dates falling between October 14th and October 22nd. That was 9 to 17 days after Earl Begley had written that their camp ward was already filled. 3 of the 14 names corresponded to entries in the pencil box. The Begley address itself, the one he was holding in his hand. The Ratliff address on Station Creek, which had gone silent October 19th and never reopened. And the name spelled Dingus, which resolved in his root memory to the Dingus family above Poverty Ridge, reachable only on foot, whose homestead he had visited 4 times and found each time with the door latched from the outside, the chickens starved, the water bucket frozen against the well housing. He sat at the table for a long time with the letter and the notebook open in front of him. He had come into this with a count: 500 undeliverable letters as evidence of an epidemic the state had undercounted. What he was now looking at was something more specific and more serious than a count. He was looking at 3 families, identifiable families with names and addresses and a soldier's first-hand eyewitness account, placing them in the path of the virus, for whom no grave had been dug, no departure recorded, no official documentation of any kind existed. Not undercounted, uncounted, entirely, as though they hadn't been there at all. The State Health Board's official figure of 34 deaths was not an undercount produced by incomplete surveying. Clem understood this now with the cold certainty of a man who has spent 11 years reading a physical route and knows the difference between a detail that was missed and a detail that was avoided. The 34 had been produced by an office that surveyed what it decided to survey, which was Grundy proper and the 3 largest camp settlements within road distance of a county seat. Everything above the first ridge had been designated in practice, if not in language, as outside the survey boundary, which meant the hollow families had not been forgotten. They had been excluded. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between an accident and a decision. He stayed at the table until the lamp needed refilling. In the second week of April, he made 2 more attempts to give the evidence to someone with authority to act on it. He wrote a letter to the Roanoke District Office of the Post Office Department, describing the discrepancy in the route's undeliverable count and its relationship to the state health board's mortality figures. He received a reply 11 days later, informing him that matters of public health statistics fell outside the department's jurisdiction, and that any concerns about the accuracy of state health records should be directed to the Virginia State Board of Health. He had already directed concerns to the Virginia State Board of Health in December. He did not write back. He also located through the Grundy Dispatch the name of a correspondent for the Roanoke Times who had written 2 articles about the coal country in 1918, a man named Arthur Depp, who covered the southwestern Virginia coal fields from a desk in Roanoke. He wrote Depp a brief letter describing the crate and the notebook and offering to show them to anyone from the paper willing to come to Grundy. He included specific figures, the official count of 34, his own undeliverable mail count, the 15 grave sites, the 3 unresolved addresses. Depp replied 10 days later. He said the story was interesting. He said his editor was interested. He said he would try to arrange a visit in May. Clem filed the letter in the back of the notebook and waited. On April 17th, Gerald Fitch appeared at the post office door before Clem had finished sorting the morning delivery. He did not look like a man delivering routine information. He looked like a man who had been sitting with something uncomfortable and had decided, after sufficient internal argument, to put it down. He said that 3 days earlier, a man had come to the Grundy post office. No identification offered, no official capacity stated. He had asked in the general and provisional tone of a man managing his exposure about the administrative management of rural Route 4 during the autumn of 1918. He had asked whether the route had produced any documentation outside the standard return process. When Fitch had pressed him, gently, carefully, the way a man with his own vulnerabilities manages a stranger, the visitor had described the documentation as correspondence records maintained beyond the carrier's authorized custody period. Fitch looked at Clem steadily. He knew what he was looking for, he just didn't want to say who sent him. Clem asked for a description. Brown coat, brown hat, a Richmond accent. Not the Western Virginia drawl, but the flat, clipped consonants of a man educated on the other side of the Blue Ridge. A leather satchel. He had stayed 20 minutes and left no name and no card. Clem thanked Fitch. He rode home. He put his horse in the barn and walked to the feed storage wall and lifted the canvas. The crate was there. All 500 letters were inside it. He could verify that at a glance, the volume and weight unchanged. The bundles were still wrapped in their rubber bands. He stood for a moment before he named what was wrong. The Station Creek bundle was spine facing north, where he always kept it, spine facing south. The Hazel Creek bundle had its rubber band doubled, where he kept them single. The composition notebook, which had traveled to and from the route in his coat for 4 days before he returned it to the crate 2 days ago, was on the right side of the crate, spine outward, where he had put it on the left side, spine facing the wall. Nothing missing, nothing damaged, nothing out of place in any way that a stranger would notice on a casual inspection. Only Clem, who had loaded and unloaded and opened and closed this crate across 5 months of daily habit, could read what had happened. Someone had been here. Someone had gone through every bundle. Someone had read the composition notebook, the cluster index, the fresh graves, the dates. the 3 addresses in the pencil box, and the handwritten copy of the letter to the State Board of Health in Richmond that Clem had never received an answer to. They had put everything back. They had not taken anything, which meant they had not come for the evidence. They had come for the inventory. They wanted to know exactly what Clem Durfee had and how thoroughly he had documented it before deciding what to do about him. He stood in the barn with one hand on the edge of the crate. The lamplight was going thin through the siding boards. The root notebook was in the wrong position, and someone in Richmond knew exactly what was inside it. And Arthur Depp of the Roanoke Times had not yet replied with a date for his visit. Clem was not a man who frightened easily. He was 67 miles below the nearest federal field office. He was on a mail route that ran through hollows. No official vehicle had entered since before the war. He had 31 years of institutional predictability working in his favor. But the man in the brown coat had been inside his barn. He had read the notebook, and he had not taken it. That was not reassurance. That was a message. Clem pulled the canvas back over the crate. He walked to the house. He sat at the table without lighting the lamp and stayed there until it was fully dark outside, thinking about what a man from Richmond does next when he has already read the evidence and already decided he cannot destroy it without creating a different kind of problem, and is still trying to identify the right kind of pressure to apply to the man who built it. He had been patient for 5 months. Whoever had been in his barn was now deciding whether patience was still an option. On the morning of April 19th, 1919, Clem Durfee sat at his kitchen table with 6 sheets of blank paper and his sharpest pencil, and copied his composition notebook by hand. He was not a fast writer. The work took 4 hours and 30 minutes. When it was finished, he had produced 2 copies of the full cluster index, the family names, the delivery addresses by creek and hollow, the first failed delivery dates, the grave observations, the 6 abandoned homesteads, and the 3 entries in the pencil box at the back of the notebook, for which the box remained empty. He folded 1 copy into an envelope addressed to Arthur Depp at the Roanoke Times, who had written in April to say he was planning a visit in May. He folded the 2nd copy into an envelope addressed to cousin Margaret Tackett, a school teacher in Akron, Ohio, with a brief note asking her to keep the enclosure safe and to open it only if she heard that something had happened to him. He mailed both envelopes from the Grundy post office that afternoon, using his own stamps, without logging either in the notebook. He had been playing defense since October. He was done playing defense. What Clem Durfee couldn't have known in April of 1919, and what would not become fully documentable until a retired school teacher named Marion Fields began pulling records in 1982, was the specific institutional machinery that had produced the number 34. The Virginia State Board of Health had not miscounted. It had decided. The process began in December 1918, when the board's field survey coordinator, a physician named Dr. Hollis Averitt, submitted a preliminary influenza mortality estimate for the state's southwestern counties. Averitt was systematic. His internal report, discovered in a Richmond archive in 1979 and uncatalogued before that date, was explicit about his methodology. He counted deaths reported through county health offices, registered hospitals, and formally licensed physicians. He made no attempt to survey any community more than 12 miles by road from a county seat. His estimate for Buchanan County's rural precincts was not 34. The words he wrote were, "Insufficient data. Recommend field verification before final publication." The field verification was never conducted. The board's director, under pressure to submit a complete state report to Washington before the federal relief allocation deadline of March 15, 1919, accepted instead the retrospective count submitted by Dr. Alton Sykes, Buchanan County's health officer, a man of good professional intentions, who had spent the entire autumn managing the cases arriving at his two-room Grundy practice, and who had not reached a single hollow settlement above the first ridge. Sykes counted deaths registered through the circuit court clerk in Grundy and through the 3 company-owned medical stations in the coalfield townships. The count was 34. The corporate dimension of that number has never been formally established in any official proceeding. What the 1983 University of Virginia paper documented, through a set of internal letters between the board's director and a representative of the Buchanan Coal Operators Association, recovered from the association's own dissolved archive, was the following. In January 1919, 3 coal companies operating in the hollow settlements of western Buchanan County were in the process of recruiting replacement labor from West Virginia and Kentucky to fill positions vacated by illness and death among the existing hollow workforce. A publicly documented high mortality count in those communities would have triggered, under a 1917 federal labor protection statute, a mandatory Department of Labor inspection of working conditions and workforce health in any region with documented epidemic losses above a specific threshold. The threshold was 50 documented deaths in any single county's non-urban precincts in a 90-day period. The official count for Buchanan County's rural precincts was 34. The threshold was never triggered. The inspection was never conducted. The replacement labor was recruited and in place by March 1919. Howard Elkin, the man in the brown coat, the man with the leather satchel and the Richmond accent, the man who had come into Clem Durfee's barn on an April afternoon and read the composition notebook and put everything back in the wrong position, was documented in the UVA paper as an administrative aide to the board's director, who was simultaneously listed in the Coal Operators Association's membership records as a consultant on workforce regulatory compliance. He had not been sent to Grundy to assess a postal irregularity. He had been sent to determine whether a rural mail carrier's unauthorized evidence collection posed a credible threat to a number that was supporting 2 separate institutional interests at once. He had concluded that it did. He had gone back to Richmond and recommended pressure. The pressure came through channels that left no direct fingerprints. Arthur Depp arrived in Grundy on May 14, 1919. He was 29 years old, thin-wired with energy, and he spent 2 hours in Clem's barn with the crate open and the composition notebook in his hands, counting 3 separate letter bundles to verify the totals. He read the cluster index twice. He read the Earl Begley letter. He stood up to leave and said, "This is the story. This is exactly what I came for." He drove back to Roanoke and wrote the piece in 4 days. He submitted it to his editor, Randolph Carver, on May 22nd. Carver held it for 11 days. On June 2nd, he returned it with a note stating that allegations against a Virginia State Health Agency required independent corroboration from a second verified source before publication. Depp pointed out that the 487 letters were 487 independent sources. Carver said the cause of their non-delivery could not be independently attributed to epidemic mortality without verification he was not in a position to conduct. Depp wrote to Clem immediately. In the final paragraph of his letter, he said, "Randolph had a note on his desk before he'd read the first line of my draft. I want you to know that. Whoever got to him did it inside of 48 hours." Clem folded the letter into the back of the notebook. He was not surprised. He had understood from the day he found the rubber bands stretched in the wrong direction that the man from Richmond had not come to take the evidence. He had come to find out how much pressure would be needed and in which direction it should be applied. The official move came on June 9th. A postal district representative named Ferris arrived in Grundy and met with Fitch for 40 minutes. He informed Fitch that the district office had received a communication from a Virginia state agency requesting a formal account of all retained undeliverable mail from rural Route 4 for the September 1918 through February 1919 period. If a complete inventory was not produced by month's end, the district would conduct a physical audit of the route carrier's personal property. Fitch found Clem in the sorting room. He said, "They want whatever you have. They're coming for it one way or another." Clem said, "Then I'll give it to you." Fitch looked at him. "To me?" "To the United States Post Office, federal custody, not to a state agency, not to Ferris's contact in Richmond. To this office, under a signed intake form, effective tomorrow morning." Fitch was quiet for several seconds. He understood what Clem was doing. First-class federal mail in the custody of the United States Post Office fell under postal jurisdiction exclusively. No state agency could compel its production, review, or destruction without a federal court order. No federal court order had been prepared because no one in Richmond had anticipated that a rural mail carrier would surrender the evidence voluntarily and strategically to the only institution that could protect it from them. "I'll get the intake forms," Fitch said. The following morning, Clem loaded the crate into a borrowed wagon and drove it 3 miles into Grundy. Fitch produced the form. Both men signed it. Ferris countersigned as district witness. The form was dated June 10th, 1919, and listed 487 pieces of undeliverable first-class mail, rural Route 4, retained by carrier. The letters entered federal custody at 9:17 in the morning. The state of Virginia never filed for their return. What happened to the letters next was a quiet, bureaucratic drift that lasted 62 years. They sat in the Grundy post office for 91 days, past the regulatory 30-day limit, because Fitch wrote twice to the Roanoke district requesting clarification on disposition procedures for letters addressed to households where the recipient was believed deceased, and received no guidance either time. In September 1919, a district directive ordered the destruction of all undeliverable mail from the 1918 to 1919 period, where return to sender was not possible. Fitch wrote back requesting formal documentation of the destruction procedure. He received no reply. He put the 487 letters in a cardboard box. He took the box home. He put it in the spare room under 2 years of seed catalogs, and then under 4, and then under 12, and then under the accumulated sediment of a man's entire retirement. And he died in 1944 at the age of 80, with the box still in the spare room, and no one in his family who knew what it contained. Clem Durfee rode rural Route 4 for 30 more years after the morning he surrendered the crate. He rode it through drought years and flood years, through a second war that took a new generation of Buchanan County boys and brought them home different, through the slow electrification of the hollow settlements and the arrival of the first telephone lines in the upper draws and the decline of the coal operations that had staffed those hollows for 40 years. The route changed incrementally over those 3 decades. New delivery points added, old ones removed as families relocated to town. But the basic geography stayed constant. The creeks were the creeks. The ridges were the ridges. He passed the dingus site on Poverty Ridge every time he worked the upper section. He passed it on horseback and then, after 1933, in a truck the Postal Department provided for carriers on established routes. There was nothing to see from the road. The path up to the homestead departed from the route at a bend above the Third Creek crossing, and unless you knew to look for it, you would not have looked. Clem always looked. He looked every time for 30 years, and every time the path was there and the hollow above it was quiet, and the site above the hollow was invisible from below, and there was nothing he could do about any of it except look. He handed in his cap in June of 1949. He told no one about the notebook. He told no one about the letters. He died in March of 1961. Marion Fields was patient in the way that people who love documents are patient, not passively, but with the specific attending calm of someone who knows that paper contains more than it appears to, and who is willing to sit with it until it opens. She was 58 years old in 1981 and had been volunteering at the Buchanan County Historical Society for 3 years when Fitch's grandson brought in the cedar chest from the Combs Creek house in November of that year. The grandson knew only that the chest had belonged to his grandfather and seemed like it might matter to someone. He left it at the front desk on a Tuesday morning and drove back to Roanoke. Marion opened it that afternoon. She found household items, ledger books, the photograph album, and then at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of canvas, the cardboard box. She lifted the lid. She looked at the top envelope. She looked at the date. She looked at the stamp on the back. Attempted. No response. With a date in October 1918 below it. She lifted the next envelope. October again, then October again, then November. She counted 47 from the top layer before she put them down. She looked at the box. She looked at the room. Then she went to the supply cabinet, brought back her cataloging pad, and sat down at the table and began. It took her 4 full days. There were 487 letters. Every one of them was addressed to a delivery point on rural Route 4. Every one bore a date between September 1918 and January 1919. At the bottom of the box, folded twice, she found a piece of paper that was not a letter. 2 handwritten pages in careful pencil, organized by creek and hollow, with names and dates and observations in columns. The paper was the cluster index. The copy Clem had mailed to Fitch directly in May 1919, 48 hours after the man in the brown coat had read the original. Marion Fields held the 2 pages for a long time. Then she made a phone call to Vera Lester, Clem Durfee's niece, still living in Grundy at 73, whose name she had found by asking the oldest people she knew, who had worked at the post office in the 1940s, whether they remembered the Route 4 carrier. Vera Lester brought the cedar chest with the composition notebook to the Historical Society in January 1982. Marion set the notebook open on the table next to the cluster index copy. They matched perfectly. The same hand, the same abbreviations for creek and hollow designations, the same habit of pressing hard enough with the pencil that the lines indented the sheets below. She looked at the two documents side by side. She looked at the 487 letters arranged on the table in their delivery point clusters. Then she sat down and wrote a letter to the Department of Public Health History at the University of Virginia and told them what she had found. The University of Virginia research team published their analysis in the American Journal of Public Health in September 1983. The paper ran 22 pages and carried 47 footnotes, the first of which acknowledged Marion Fields by name. The team's central estimate for influenza mortality in Buchanan County's rural precincts between September 1918 and February 1919 was 476 individuals, placing the real death toll at approximately 14 times the official figure of 34. The Virginia state record, they noted, represented 7.1% of the most probable actual total. The paper addressed the three unresolved addresses. For the Begley family, a death record search in Mingo County, West Virginia, produced a late-filed certificate from 1921. A surviving daughter, relocated across the state line at the end of 1918, had finally registered her father's death 3 years after the fact. For the Ratliff family, a primitive Baptist church burial register on the Kentucky border recorded 2 Ratliff deaths from the fever in October 1918, with a notation that the deceased had come down from the Virginia side. For the Dingus family above Poverty Ridge, the team found nothing. No death certificate in any county or state. No church burial record in any register they located across a 6-state search. No descendant identified through 3 years of genealogical research. One neighbor interviewed in 1982 at the age of 91 recalled with careful vagueness that there had been people living up the path above the Good Trail, and that they had not come down in the autumn of 1918, and that he had not thought to ask why. The team's lead researcher visited the site in May 1983. He hiked the path above the Third Creek crossing on the upper section of rural Route 4. He found the homestead, collapsed roof, a stone chimney still vertical, a wall line visible as a low ridge in the ground, a well housing buried in 20 years of brush. He spent 40 minutes at the site and took 11 photographs. In his field notes, he wrote, 4 names in a soldier's letter, a path on a mail carrier's route, a chimney in the woods. This is the complete record of this family's existence in any document we have been able to locate. In 1984, a coalition of public health historians petitioned the Virginia Department of Health to review Buchanan County's official 1918 influenza mortality figure in light of the UVA paper's findings. The department replied that pre-1950 epidemic records were a matter of historical archive rather than active public health administration, and that corrections to historical figures fell outside the department's current operational mandate. The petition was not renewed. The official figure was not corrected. The 487 letters are held today at the Buchanan County Historical Society in Grundy, Virginia, in acid-free archival boxes, organized by delivery cluster, Upper Hazel Creek, Station Creek, Poverty Ridge. In the sequence, Clem Durfee established in the autumn of 1918. The composition notebook is stored alongside them. Marion Fields's cataloging notes, 47 handwritten pages, are stored in a separate folder. The Earl Begley letter, opened by Clem on the evening of April 8, 1919, in full knowledge that it was a federal offense to do so, is stored in a protective sleeve apart from the Station Creek cluster, with a museum accession tag that describes it as opened by the route carrier outside standard postal procedure. The tag does not characterize this as a crime. It calls it a decision. The Dingus Homestead site on Poverty Ridge is private timberland. There is no marker. There is no sign. The path above the Third Creek crossing is still there. It is passable on foot in dry weather. No one has placed a marker at the site because there is no legal name to put on one. No death certificate, no family claimant, no official record of any kind that would support a formal commemoration. There is a chimney. There is a well housing under the brush. There is a soldier's letter in an archive in Grundy that names 4 people who lived up above where the path ends, written in October 1918 by a young man who was counting on the cold to stop it. The Virginia State Board of Health's official influenza mortality count for Buchanan County remains 34. It has stood in the archived report for 107 years. No amendment has been filed. No erratum appended. No correction entered. Clem Durfee rode 34.2 miles of mountain road for 31 years and built the only document that says otherwise. He did it with a pencil and a composition notebook and an old saddlebag and the specific daily attention of a man whose job required him to notice when something that should be present was not. He called what he found a count. He wrote it down. He mailed copies to 2 people in case someone came for the original. He surrendered the letters to the only institution that could protect them. He rode his route for 30 more years and said nothing publicly, and died at 87 and left the notebook in a cedar chest with a sentence on the inside cover that his niece could not bring herself to throw away. The number 34 is still 34, but somewhere in a hollow above Poverty Ridge, a chimney is still standing, and in a cardboard box that a postmaster took home in September of 1919 because he could not bring himself to write the word destroyed on a federal form, 487 letters are still waiting in their archival sleeves, addressed to people who could not receive them, sorted by the hand of the man who carried them, organized by the route he rode, counted by the count that says the number is not 34. The count is 476, and it has always been 476.